Was it good to follow along while you were unable to make it? Okay, excellent. Okay, today we are looking at face-to-face as a friend. That's our study today, is face-to-face as a friend. It's our series on prayers and pray-ers of power. And we're looking at Moses as a prayer of power. His prayer life, if you will. Last week, for our Easter message, we looked at probably his most famous prayer, which is the Song of Moses in Exodus 15. And that told us where his focus was. When he thought of God within his sanctuary. He thought of God as being in a place that is approachable in time and space. And that is what the psalmist was looking at in Psalm 77, where God's way is found in the sanctuary. We're going to find that is a theme of Moses as we look at his prayer life. We're going to be looking at his whole life, and his life was a life that was full, 120 years, and you can break Moses' life up into three. The first 40 years was his time training in Egypt to be a prince within Egypt. The next 40 years was his time exiled as a shepherd, and the final 40 years was his years delivering Israel from Egypt and wandering in the wilderness. So you can break up his 120 years very neatly into three lots of 40. And the interesting thing is most of his life is passed over very summarily. But we'll get to that in a moment. I want to look first of all at a verse which mentions Moses, which I think has been done very poorly in many translations. Let's go to John chapter 1, verse 17. Now, I love the preamble of John. John has a preamble that goes for 18 verses. It's worth a series of sermons on its own. And it starts with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the same was in the beginning with God. It's a beautiful discussion, and where John doesn't have a nativity message, he doesn't have a focus on Jesus' birth, this qualifies as that. This is often used in Christmas messages because it talks about the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of God, of the Father. And then we get to this verse in verse 17, which says, "For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." Does anyone have anything different there? Does anyone have a conjunction in there?
But.
Yeah, but. And this is one of those words that you can scribble out because it doesn't actually have anything in the Greek for it. So a lot of the translations consider this to be two things that are being contrasted with each other. Now that's one way that you could put two thoughts together. Sorry? So some of them will have this. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So it's in italics, so it's not there. There's no Greek. The Greek, which would be either de or Allah, is not found in the Greek. So they've supplied this to create a contrast. Now, I think that it's rather supposed to be a juxtaposition instead of a contrast. And, yeah, so there's not even an and. There's no kai. There's nothing. It's just now, it's not even two things that are supposed to be. The verb is different. The verb is different in these two instances. The verb for the first thought is the law was given through Moses, as in it was handed through Moses. It didn't originate through Moses, but the second clause, which says grace and truth came through Jesus, this is the word egeneto, which means to be originated through, sourced through. The source of grace and truth is Jesus. Moses was not the source of the law. Who was the source of the law? Jesus. Jesus was the source of the law. what the writer here, what John is doing, is he's not contrasting that the law is something that originated with Moses and grace and truth originated with Jesus. What he's contrasting is that Moses was just a intermediary. He was someone who passed it along. It was given to him and he gave it to everyone else. It's not saying that the law is worse than grace and truth, because grace and truth are the law. Okay, we're going to see that in a moment. And I just think Moses gets a bit of a bad name within Christendom because the Old Testament is considered to be done away with, and we're in the New Testament. There's a lot of Christians that act this way. The original Christian church that Jesus set up used the Old Testament as their scriptures. They didn't have the New Testament. And so what John is saying is not that, the law is obsolete, it was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus. What he's saying is that Jesus is the source and Moses was just a person that was part of the chain of getting things to us. He's saying Jesus is where you can get the source of everything. The grace and truth are found in the law. When we look at the greatest commandment, what is the greatest commandment? Love God with all your heart, soul, strength. That's found that's called the Shema. That's found in Deuteronomy 6. And the second law, which is like unto it, which is what? Love your neighbor. That's from Leviticus. It's from the heart of the law. So when we look at grace and truth, we're going to see that grace and truth are in the law, and that they're a part, and that it's very intricately. The only way we know it is because we know Moses' prayer life. Moses found out these things through his prayer life. So let's go and have a look at what we learn. So the first 2 chapters of Exodus are basically covering about 80 of his years of his life, mostly the first 40. So the first 2 chapters, we hear about the birth of Moses, and that's a very famous story. Then we hear about how Moses flees away from. So this is really chapter 2. Chapter 2 of Exodus deals with the birth and then the exile of Moses, where he flees to Midian when he kills the Egyptian, the slave master. I'm not reading a verse. I'm just telling you. This is chapter 2. So in one chapter, we get a whole 80 years of Moses' life skipped over. And then we come to, he's now 80 years old when we get to chapter 3. Because this is where God calls him. So it's very interesting. We don't see a lot about Moses having a relationship with God in those first 80 years. But God had a relationship with Moses. How do we know that? God called him as a deliverer. And Moses got in the way of his own calling. Has anyone ever got in the way of their own calling? I have. God's called me to do something and then I act in a certain way. And for Moses, he got in the way so much that he was 80 by the time he was ready to fulfill the calling that God had called him to. Sorry? That he'd had 80 years at his birth. He was called to be a deliverer within Israel. And so he's an example of someone who got in the way of his own calling. And Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock into the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And verse 2, this is chapter 3, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. It says who met him. Who did he meet? In verse 2. The angel of Yahweh. Who is the angel of Yahweh? Jesus. We've been over this very many times. This is not God the Father. This is Jesus. The angel of Yahweh, or messenger of Yahweh, is Jesus. He's not an angel in nature. He's an angel in role. His role is to be the messenger of the covenant. And so when we see this title, Angel of Yahweh, it's always Jesus when it's the angel of Yahweh. And so this is the same person that we've looked at in our Prayers of Power series. This is the same person who met with Noah, who met with Abraham, who met with Hagar, who met with all of these people in Genesis, who wrestle with Jacob. This is Jesus, and now we see him turn up in the story of Moses 80 years after he, was called. And this is the first time that we see a conversation between Moses and God. And it's God initiating it. God comes to Moses to initiate. We've seen that as a bit of a theme, that God shows up to call us. We don't call out to God, he calls us first. He's always calling us. And so we know the story. He's in the burning bush and God is calling him to go and speak God's words to Pharaoh. And Moses said to God, if I come to the people in Israel, this is verse 13, and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask of me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent you. Now, when we look at the name of God, what is the name of God? I just said it before, Yahweh. Does anyone know what Yahweh means? Yahweh means he is. All right? So Yahweh is in the form of the word, it means he is, the one who is, the one who exists. That's what Yahweh means. But God doesn't use the word Yahweh here because he is speaking self-referentially. He's speaking of himself. He can't say, tell them that he is sent you, because he's speaking about himself then. He says, Ehyeh. He uses Ehyeh, Asher Ehyeh. I am who I am, is what he says. And so he's saying, we can't say Ehyeh, so we don't call God Ehyeh because we would be saying, I am. When we say Yahweh, and so when we see the name all the way through the scriptures, we see the name Yahweh, which means he is. So we call him he is, he calls himself I am. Does that make sense? Yahweh doesn't mean I am, it means he is. Ehyeh means I am. And this is one of the few times we see this in scripture. So he says, go and say that I am has called you. And so God, obviously Moses would use the word Yahweh. So he says, God said to Moses, say to this people of Israel, Yahweh, then he uses Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. So God is showing up and he's introducing himself. Isn't that amazing? At 80 years old, the first time we see Moses speaking to God, and we can surmise from this that Moses didn't really have an active prayer life before this because he didn't know who he was speaking to. When he spoke to God, like he was speaking to God previously as more of an out there concept, a God out there. Now he was a God who was introducing himself. God is wanting to have that same relationship with all of us, that really intimate relationship. And so God introduces himself to Moses by name and starts to have a relationship with him there. This is the first time. Now we're going to see that Moses. I'm going to skip through a lot of Moses's prayers. Moses prayed to end the plagues. There's some of the prayers that we see Moses pray. So when it was time for when Pharaoh had enough of one of the plagues, Moses would pray to God, and the plague would end. So he would end the plague through prayer. Moses also prayed to part the Red Sea. And we saw last week that he prayed after the Red Sea was parted with this beautiful song, the Song of Moses. Then we see that Moses prayed for manna when the children of Israel complained about not having food. He prayed for water when they didn't have water. These can be found in Exodus 16 and 17. You see that Moses has taken on a praying to God, not for himself, is he? When he's praying to God, who's he praying for? On behalf of others. He has become an intercessor. When he entered into a prayer relationship with God, he entered into a relationship as an intercessor for God. When God said, go and speak on my behalf, Moses was going as an intercessor to speak God's words. And so when he spoke words to God, it was generally for others as well. So it actually worked both ways. Moses became an intercessor. And that's why I love Moses, because Moses is not, Moses was this, but Jesus was that. Moses was an example or a type of Jesus in many ways. He typified the relationship Jesus has to the Father because Jesus is the mediator. Jesus is the one who speaks our words to God, doesn't he? And he speaks God's words to us. That's what he said when he was here on earth. And so I think we need to realize that Moses is far more significant than being obsolete. Now, I'm going to come back to Exodus 32 to 34 in a moment, but I want to look at some of the other times. So when Miriam was complaining, remember when Miriam and Aaron were complaining against Moses? What happened to Miriam and Aaron? Well, what happened to Miriam specifically? She got leprosy. How did that end? How did she stop having leprosy? Moses prayed for her. We see that in Numbers 12. Numbers 14, the people of Israel murmured and Moses prayed again on their behalf. We'll come to that one in a moment. And we see that Moses laid hands on Joshua at the end of his life and prayed for Joshua. So these are the things that we see in the prayer life of Moses. The only time that we really see him praying to God for himself was when he was exasperated when they were complaining against him in Numbers 11. But I want to look and focus at the story of Moses as an intercessor, primarily in chapters 32 to 34, because it tells us something. We're going to learn a lot about not only Moses, but God as a hearer of intercessory prayer. God as one who hears prayer, and how we can be intercessors within that mode. So I'm going to tell the story of what happens after the crossing the Red Sea. Because if I tell the story, you'll understand where they get to. When they crossed the Red Sea, they were to go to Mount Sinai. And they got to Mount Sinai on the 50th day of their marching out of Israel. Now the 50th day was the same as Pentecost. So we understand that Pentecost, when the Spirit fell upon the believers in the upper room, that was the same day that historically the Ten Commandments was given. So when we think about the New Testament being, doing away with the Old Testament, it doesn't. It actually is just recapitulating the Old Testament. At Sinai, God was speaking his words to them. At Pentecost, he was letting his Spirit fall upon them. It was the same. It was the antitype of Sinai. God was wanting to take what happened at Sinai and make it in the hearts of every person. I will take my laws and I will write them on your hearts. That was what God's plan always was. Now, when he got to Sinai, in chapter 19 of Exodus, you see that God tells Moses what his plan is. I want you to be a royal priesthood. I want you to be a nation, a peculiar nation for me. Now, these words were what God intended in Moses' day. They were used later by Peter. Peter said that you are to be a royal, you're a chosen generation, you're a royal priesthood, you're a peculiar people. That was what God always intended. So the story of what happened for Israel was meant to be what happened in the New Testament. God always intended it in that way. And so then he speaks his words from Mount Sinai. Now what happens is that this cloud comes over the top of Mount Sinai, and if you look at Jabal al-Lawz on the satellite imagery, you can go to Google Earth and look at Jabal al-Lawz, which I believe is the true Mount Sinai in Arabia. And we know that Sinai was in Arabia, that's what Paul tells us. And so if you look at Jabal al-Lawz, it is black on top. Okay, it is just burnt black. It looks like it's seared black. And that is the place that I believe Mount Sinai is. If you look at all of the geographical clues within the Exodus account and in the rest of the Bible, that's where Mount Sinai would be. And so this cloud descended, and bright lights, thunderings and everything, and they were not even to go to the foot of the mountain because they didn't want to die. So they were terrified, and when God spoke, because the children of Israel didn't have the same relationship Moses had, they were too afraid to hear anymore. At the end of the 10 Commandments being spoken by God, the Israelites were like, we can't bear it anymore. If he speaks anymore, we're going to die. We're just so terrified. Can you go up into the mountain and hear the rest of what he has to say? So the 10 Commandments wasn't the totality of the law of God, of the Torah. It was the succinct form. The 10 Commandments wasn't everything that God wanted to morally say to Israel. It was the abbreviated form. Moses then goes up, and chapter 20 is the giving of the 10 Commandments. Chapters 21 to 23, Moses gets the expanded version of the 10 Commandments. So God expands upon it and gives a much more narrow specifics for how they were to live their lives within the accordance of the Ten Commandments. And then he comes back down. They make a covenant, and God's covenant was, I will do this in you. The Ten Commandments were never, don't you dare commit adultery, don't you dare murder. That's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew gives it the ability that it can be read as a promise. I'm the Lord your God that brought you out of the land of Israel, out of the land of bondage. Therefore, you will have no other gods before me. Therefore, you will not make for yourself any graven image. Therefore, so God was promising that because I've done this for you, you'll also not do this if you're in that relationship. God intended his covenant as a grant. I'm granting you land. I'm granting you descendants. The covenants were land and descendants. I'm granting you land and descendants. And these are the rules that I'll put inside you. But because they had that fear relationship, they promised God that they would do it. And that's what we see in Exodus chapter 24. They make a promise. All that the Lord has said we will do. God never asked them to make that promise. But God said, fine, I'll deal with you on that promise, on the grounds of that promise. So then Moses goes up into the mountain again. So he's gone up into the mountain to get the expanded Ten Commandments. He goes up into the mountain again, and this is where he gets the ceremonial law, if you will. And I don't like that label because I think that it's a different way of, but he gets the Levitical laws. He gets what I mean there is he gets the sanctuary. He's given a blueprint of the sanctuary. He's given the significance of all of the sacrifices, what you're supposed to do on these days, what this sacrifice is for, guilt offerings, gift offerings, thank offerings, all of those things. He's given all of the specifics on how they are to worship him. The first time he goes up into the mountain, he's given moral statutes that apply to their circumstances. The second time he goes up, and this is a longer period of time. He's up there for 40 days, getting the blueprints, getting everything to do with that. Now, they've made a covenant before he goes up into the mountain the second time. He goes up into the mountain this second time. He comes down, and before he comes down, God says, and this is where we pick up in Exodus 32. Okay, so in Exodus 32, while he's been up in the mountain receiving all of the blueprints for how the worship service is supposed to go, what's happening downstairs is that they are getting antsy. They're getting impatient. Where has he gone? Maybe he's died. Maybe he's been consumed by all of these manifestations of divine power. We're terrified. Maybe that's what's happened to Moses. Now, this is a miraculous time. Moses was being preserved up there. There's no evidence that he was, unless God gave him food and water, he didn't have food and water. So this is very similar to when Jesus went out into the wilderness. He's essentially fasting to all intents and purposes up in the mountain, living off the presence of God. He's living off the presence of God. And the people downstairs, down the bottom of the mountain, they're thinking he's gone. He's consumed. We've lost Moses. And so they start to go, okay, well, we need someone to lead us. And so they go to Aaron, make us a god. Make us a god like... 40 days earlier, you had one job, which was to do what you promised. 40 days earlier, they promised all that the Lord has said we will do. And I think this is why God accepted their covenant, because he knew that they couldn't keep it. So 40 days later, they're making an idol. They're taking all of this gold and they're melting it into a golden calf. And God tells Moses about it. Moses doesn't have a clue what's going on down the bottom. Moses is told by God what is happening. So, verse 25, when Moses saw the people had broken loose, for Aaron had let them break loose to the derision of their enemies, then Moses stood at the gate of the camp and said, this is a little bit before that. God had told Moses that he was going to destroy the people. So in verse 7, Yahweh said to Moses, go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Israel have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I've commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And Yahweh said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them in order to make you a great nation out of you. So God said, Moses, they couldn't even wait 40 days. I'm going to just consume them. Out of your loins I'll make a great nation. Okay? Keep this in mind. Moses implored Yahweh his God and said, O Yahweh, why does your wrath burn hot against your people who you've brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains and consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. And Yahweh relented from the disaster he had spoken of bringing on his people. This is so amazing. This is so amazing. Moses speaks to God, and he addresses God and says, are you sure, God? Are you sure you want to do this? And he reminds him of something. What does he remind him? What does he throw in God's face? His own promise. His own promise. It's going to be very interesting when I tie all this together. He takes what God has spoken of about himself. God introduced himself to Moses, said, I am that I am. I am the one who exists. He has had other conversations with Moses throughout this time. And to the point where obviously Moses knows the book of Genesis. He wrote the book of Genesis. So he's taking the promise that has been revealed to him that had happened generations earlier in Abraham's time and saying, remember Abraham, remember Isaac, remember Israel, remember what you promised them. You can't do this. He's taking God's own words and giving them back to him. That's how we intercede for people. We take God and his character and his words and we say to God, remember what you said. Now, God was testing, I believe, similar to what he did with Abraham. God is a God of mercy. He doesn't have to be reminded who he is. But he enters into, can God still have anger? Of course he can. God was angry. This is the same people who said that they had sacrificed and said, all that the Lord has said, we will do. And so God had every right, didn't he? Did he have every right to start over? Of course he did. He has every right to start over with us as well. The only thing that we can possibly do is remind him of Jesus, remind him of his promise. We can't argue with him about the merits of our own works. We can only take to him what is his. And he wants us to do that. I think he wants us to do that. I think that we're going to see that this is exactly what Moses was supposed to do. The next day Moses said to the people, you have sinned a great sin. This is verse 30. And now I will go up to Yahweh. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. So Moses returned to Yahweh and said, alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold. But now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. Yahweh said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. But now go, lead the people to the place which I have spoken to you. Behold, my angel should go before you. Nevertheless, in the day that I visit, I will visit their sin upon them. So he's saying, you can't pay for another person's sins, Moses. Moses stands there and says, let me pay for their sins. And God said, no one can pay for their sins, but an angel's going to go before you. Who's the angel? Jesus. It's Jesus. There is an angel. When God said to Abraham, go and sacrifice your son, and Abraham was ready to do it, and Isaac was ready to be sacrificed, did God let him go through with it? No. Because God doesn't work that way. Humans don't get to be sacrificed for another. What did he provide? He provided a ram. And God is saying that, Moses, you want that's great, that's all well and good, and you're reflecting my character by saying that please blot me out, but I'm going to send an angel before you. I will visit the sin, but I'm sending an angel first. Isn't that amazing? Now we come to chapter 33. And in chapter 33, we see that they're commanded to leave Sinai. And so let's just read the first bit. Yahweh said to Moses, "Depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, to the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it. I'll send an angel before you, and I'll drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." He's sending the angel, but he himself is not going. Okay? And the angel is Jesus. When the people heard this disastrous word, they mourned, and no one put on their ornaments. For Yahweh said to Moses, "Say to the people, you are stiff-necked people, for if for a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you. Take off your ornaments, that I may know what to do with you." Coming down, Moses used to take, verse 7, Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, far off from the camp. So this was before the tabernacle. They had a smaller, simpler tent. There was a tent of meeting. Before they built the tabernacle, they had what was called the tent of meeting. And he had it far off from the camp, and he called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought Yahweh would go to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. When they created the tabernacle was in the middle of the tent. This one, beforehand, they had to go outside of the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would rise up, and each would stand at his tent door and watch Moses until he had gone into the tent. When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and Yahweh would speak with Moses. When all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise up and worship, each at his own tent door. Thus Yahweh would speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to a friend. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that now, what was the cloud? What was the cloud that went and stood at the entrance? The cloud. It says the cloud it was Jesus himself. Jesus was the cloud. The cloud, the rock that followed them was Christ. Jesus was the cloud, and he's going and meeting Moses and speaking face to face as a friend. Keep that in mind, because it seems like there's a contradiction, and a lot of people think there's a contradiction in the Bible because what we're going to go a little bit further down. So Moses is interceding, and he makes a prayer at the end of this chapter. Let's have a look. So Moses said to Yahweh, verse 12, "See, you do not say to me, bring this people, but you have let me know that you will send whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favour in my sight. Now therefore, if I have found favour in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I may know you in order to find favour in your sight. Consider too that this nation is your people." And he said, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And he said to him, "If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here." So he's saying that my presence, I won't go, but my presence will go. Who is the presence of God? Jesus. Keep this in mind. "If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favour in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in your going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth?" And Yahweh said to Moses, "This very thing that you have spoken I will do, for you have found favour in my sight, and I know you by name." Moses said, "Please show me your glory." And he said, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you my name, Yahweh. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. But," he said, "you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." Now, is this a contradiction? Earlier in the same chapter, it says that Moses spoke to God face to face like a friend. Now he's saying, "You can't see my face." What's going on? What is happening here?
It looks like a contradiction, doesn't it?
It looks like a contradiction. It's using the same word face, panim. I think it's the Father. So some people have said, well, the first one is just a simile. It's just using a figure of speech, like he's face to face like a friend. But we know that Jesus was the one he was speaking to. The one that wasn't going to go with them was the Father, and that's the one who's speaking to Moses now. Moses is hearing from God and saying, I can show my goodness before you. Who is the goodness of God? Jesus. He's going to make his goodness go before him, but he himself can't be seen. The Bible says that in the New Testament, who no man has seen nor can see. That God is in light unapproachable. In Timothy, Paul talks about God dwelling in light unapproachable, who no man has seen nor can see. Why can't we see him? Sin. He is light, and we have darkness in us. We have been in too much darkness. If he was to let his light come forward into us, we would be consumed. Any darkness would be consumed. We can't handle it. Will we see God one day?
Yes.
How do we know? It's in the Beatitudes, isn't it? Blessed are the pure in heart, they will see God. They will see God. It's a promise. But we can't see him now. So it's not a forever thing that we can't see him. It's just right now we can't. And so how can we see God? How do we see God?
Through Jesus.
In Jesus. Jesus is how we see God. And how did Moses see God? Through Jesus. It's only through Jesus that he could see God. Otherwise he would have perished. When God shows up on Mount Sinai, he has to clothe himself. How does he clothe himself on Sinai? Thick clouds.
Yes,
He has to.
you can't see. You can't see.
Without those thick clouds, they would have all been consumed. Even Moses. When Moses spent time up in the mountain and he comes back down, he's glowing. We're going to see that in a moment. And that's with the cloud protection. Okay? There's no sunscreen for God. Okay? Only sunscreen. Okay? Oh, I thought you guys were not here. Good to see you. Yeah? I believe both were at Mount Sinai. Because Jesus is called a lawgiver and so is God. Yeah. Well, here's how I know that. Just to answer that question, was the Father and Jesus at Mount Sinai. Come to chapter 23. Remember when I said that when Moses, after the Ten Commandments, they sent him up to the mountain to hear everything. The extended version of the Ten Commandments. The very end of what the extended version of the Ten Commandments, we can see in verse 20 of chapter 23. Behold, I will send an angel before you. So if the angel is Jesus, who has to be speaking here? The Father. This has to be the Father speaking about Jesus. I will send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I've prepared. Pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. This phrase, my name is in him, is a way of saying he is my son. When Jacob adopted Manasseh and Ephraim, who were his grandkids, they were Joseph's kids, when he adopted them, he said, let my name be on them or in them. Let them take my name. We even have this in our cultures today, many of our cultures, where the child takes the name of the father. And so when he says, my name is in him, he's saying, this is my son. So this angel was the Son of God. And so that's how I know that they were both there at Sinai. So coming back to chapter 33, this very thing I've spoken to you. So he says, I'm going to show you my goodness. I'll make my goodness pass before you. I'm jumping now to chapter 34. So this is the interesting thing. So the Lord, Yahweh, says to Moses, cut for yourself 2 tablets of stone like the first, and I will write on the tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Be ready by the morning. So how did he break the tablets, by the way? He smashed them. Now, just to give a bit more background here, there's nowhere does it say that Moses cut the first 2 tablets. He was given the first 2 tablets, okay? Because God cut them himself. God cut the first 2 tablets himself. He smashed them on the image, and that it broke apart. It got ground to nothing, so that it was because the law had been broken. The law had been broken. God wrote the 10 Commandments. Yeah, not to make graven image and not to worship other gods. They broke the whole thing. And so he smashed it. Now, is there another place in Scripture, by the way, where a stone that's cut without hands smashes an image? Daniel? Okay, that's the law. And so the law, because it had been broken, Moses signified that by smashing the law. And that law destroyed the image. The law destroyed the image as he broke it down. It just burst into smithereens at that moment. And so because of that, the law had to be reprinted. And now this time it was done in cooperation. The first time, it appears that it was supernaturally God handed him tablets that he had no part in. But God wrote the second tablets second commandments on tablets that Moses had given. Moses had to cut them. When we break God's commandments, we have to cooperate with him by giving him ourselves. By giving him ourselves to write the law on. Does that make sense? It's a beautiful picture.
And there's another application of that too, when you think that Jesus became incarnate.
Yes.
So God was allowing us as human beings to participate in that.
Through his flesh.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
That's right. Yep. So he says, cut these new tablets and bring them to me. Be ready by the morning and come up in the morning to Mount Sinai and present yourself there to me on top of the mountain. No one shall come up with you, and let no one be seen through all the mountain. Let no flocks or herds graze opposite the mountain. So Moses cut 2 tablets of stone like the first. He rose early in the morning and went up on Mount Sinai as Yahweh commanded him. And he took the 2 tablets of stone. Yahweh descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of Yahweh. Yahweh passed before him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. And Moses quickly bowed his head toward the earth and worshipped. And he said, if now I have found favour in your sight, O Yahweh, Adonai, Adonai, please let the Lord go in the midst of us, for it is a stiff-necked people, and pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your inheritance. Now this is amazing. When God passes before Moses, while he's passing before him, he's probably writing the 10 Commandments, right? Now, do the 10 Commandments have anything to do with the character of God? When he proclaims his name, he tells a whole story about who he is. He says, I'm Yahweh. Yahweh, the merciful, the gracious, slow to anger, but I won't clear those who stay guilty. I won't clear those who stay guilty, but I am merciful. He proclaims his whole character. But what he's saying here in this discussion of who he is, in this revelation of who he is, can already be found in the 10 Commandments. Where can we find this? Are any of these words similar to the 10 Commandments? Where do we see some of these words? Where it says, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the father on the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. Isn't that found in the 10 Commandments? That's found in the 3rd commandment, isn't it? Come to the 10 Commandments. It's a combination of 2 of them. So we see it in the 2nd and 3rd commandment. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I am the Lord your God. I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and 4th generation, but showing steadfast to those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. And we see similar thought in the 3rd commandment. The Lord will not hold him guiltless who holds his name in vain. So this idea of guilt and this idea of love is found enshrined within the 10 Commandments. So when God appears before Moses, he says, this is who I am, Moses. And it was already seen in the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments already enshrined that idea of Yahweh's name and his character, of a loving God who also wouldn't tolerate sin. He won't tolerate sin, but he'll provide a way for sin. Now, I find it interesting that immediately after Moses is told who God is, Moses then shoves those words back in God's face and says, please, because of who you are as a forgiving, gracious, and merciful God, please pardon our iniquity and our sin and take us for your inheritance. Isn't that amazing? Now, we see it one more time, okay, in Moses' life where he's interceding, and it's in Numbers chapter 14. So the people have rebelled again because this is their rinse and repeat. Now, I say again, but I could look at my life and say, I've rebelled again. Okay, we can all say, look at our lives and say, we rebelled again.
Yeah.
And so don't look at the people of Israel and say, those, useless people, because that's us, that's me. We can all look at ourselves and say, again. Now in chapter 14, after they've rebelled, in verse 11, Yahweh said to Moses, "How long will this people despise me? How long will they not believe in me in spite of all the signs I have done among them? I will strike them with the pestilence and disinherit them. I will make of you a great nation, mightier than they." So he's saying the exact same things that he said to Moses at Sinai. Now they're not at Sinai anymore, they're wandering. Moses intercedes for the people by saying, "But Moses said to Yahweh, then the Egyptians will hear of it, for you brought up this people in your might from among them, and they will tell the inhabitants of this land, they have heard that you, O Yahweh, are in the midst of this people. You, O Yahweh, are seen face to face, and your cloud stands over them." So there's that word face to face again. Your cloud stands over them, and you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and in a pillar of fire by night. Now if you kill this people as one man, then the nations that have heard of your fame will say, "It is because Yahweh was not able to bring this people into the land that he swore to give them, and he has killed them in the wilderness. Now, please let the power of the Lord be as great as you have promised," saying, and then he throws God's words back at him, saying, "Yahweh is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation." And then he repeats his request, "Please pardon the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now." Now, this is what I want to tell about intercession. When we intercede, we are taking God's words and reminding him of who he is, not because he doesn't remember who he is, but because we don't remember who he is. If you want to be an intercessor, you need to dwell on God's character. You need to be asking God to constantly reveal to you, his character, his glory. What is his glory? That he is a loving God, that he is slow to anger. He won't clear the iniquity that isn't, he's made a way for that. But if you stay in iniquity, he's not going to clear that. But he is merciful, he is gracious. When we intercede for people, we don't just say, "Be with such and such." We say, "God, because you are who you say you are, I'm asking for you to act into this space. I'm asking for you to act into this area." I think that he needs that because we need that. Okay? We need to remember who he is. Moses had that friendship as a friend. We can focus on the face-to-face part, but as a friend, as he got to know God, he got to know what God was like. And then he got to act like God was like. When Moses was interceding, he was doing what God wanted him to do. When Abraham interceded, he was doing what God wanted him to do. When we intercede, we're doing what God wants us to do. I saw it recently said this way. Intercession, the way we think intercession works, is that it's a human act to bring God to a place where we want him to be. We think of intercession in that way, that the intercession is our act to gain from God the compliance to act in accordance with our own wishes. Isn't that how we think? That's how I often thought of intercession.
And it's a very controlling thing. It makes us feel like we can have some degree of control of this situation instead of allowing God to be the one that is given all the glory for that opportunity, for that option.
Exactly. Yeah. So the opposite is actually true. Intercessory prayer and intercession is a divine act to bring us into a compliance with what God wishes already. That's what intercession is. And isn't that revolutionary when you think about it in that way? When we engage in intercessory prayer, we're cooperating with what God already wants. We're not bringing God into cooperation with what we want. And so when we look at Moses' story, how did it start? God introduced himself through a divine act to Moses and said, "Let me introduce myself. Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I am that who I am. I'm the one who created you. I'm the God of your fathers. I'm the God who did all of these wonderful things of old, and I'm going to do wonderful things in you. And I'm going to do it. You're not going to do it. I'm going to do it. Oh, but I'm too scared to talk. That's okay. I'll make a way. I'll make a way for anything that you have as an obstacle. I will do it. And as Moses gets to know this God, then he cooperates. He's brought into a parallel relationship where he now is asking God the things that God wanted him to ask in the first place. That's what intercession is. Intercession is us asking of God what he wants us to ask of God. It's not us asking God what he didn't want us, what he was like, oh, thank you for reminding me about these people that you're praying for. I didn't even know about it. Thank you for reminding me of who I am. I didn't know about that. We are entering into cooperation with him, not the other way around. And that is the revolution. So we are all called to be intercessors. Not all of us are called to a specific intercessory ministry. Not everyone is called to be a specific intercessor, but we can all be intercessors in some way or another. Some have a special, like everyone can teach, right? Everyone can teach the things of God, but some are called to be teachers. Some can, all can intercede on behalf of people we love. Some people have intercessory ministry, but whether you're doing it as a specific ministry, as Moses did, or whether you're doing it for your family, your friends, your colleagues, people you meet on the street, you're cooperating with God. You're entering into what he has called you to do, just like Moses did. Okay, so when we come back, I just want to finish on the idea we started, which is that Bible verse where it says the Torah was given through Moses. It didn't originate from Moses. It was given through Moses. No buts. The next thought is grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Where do we see the words grace and truth in the story that we've looked at? Grace and truth was when he passed before him, when he passed before Moses, he uses those words. He talks about him being a God of grace and truth, merciful and long-suffering. That was Jesus. And we saw that the grace and truth is enshrined in the law. It's not a contrast where the law was this thing done away with. Grace and truth originates with Jesus. It's found in the Torah. It's found in our lives. It's found all around us. And that's what we bring to God. I use the words throw it in his face, but it's not about that. It's just saying, God, I remembered who you are. Please act in this way. Any questions on that?
I think they're almost like kids raising with their parents. Parent-child relationship.
But I also see another aspect to it. Like when we engage in this kind of relationship, in a two-way street relationship with God,
Yes.
it then builds our faith because we actually because he gives us the desire to call him on who he is,
Yeah.
and then we see his action in that space and we go, oh my goodness, God, you are so good. So by him being himself and also engaging with us, it benefits us in so many different ways that then encourages us again to engage in that process. So it just becomes this, I don't know, this roll-on effect of seeing God for who he is, him showing us who he is, us reminding or just saying those words out loud, seeing him respond to that, and then encouraging us again to know that he is faithful, to know that he's gracious, to know that he is good, to know that he's just,
Yes.
and actually being even more eager.
I think this is a good. This brings a good practical point, which I didn't think to bring. So thank you. When Moses started out, he didn't have that faith.
No.
God had to turn a stick into a snake.
Correct.
He didn't start by leading the people out of Egypt. And I think we can do the similar thing, where we can test God in our day-to-day lives. God wants to work in our lives. So take some things that you've got on this week and give them to God to work in, and see whether you feel a more abundance coming out of them when you intercede in those small areas. They might be just day-to-day tasks that you're doing, and see what comes out of it and test God and see that he is good. And that's a way, so you can intercede in some small areas, and then if you get faith built up by turning a stick into a serpent and back again, then you might be able to lead a nation out of bondage. Okay? That's how quickly it can happen. Going from that, he was then calling down plagues and ending plagues. in cooperation with God. Yeah.
In that process, like he reveals himself to us first.
Yep.
You know, you know that
He's a
God
great
first
initiator.
Loved us.
Yes.
Which
Yes.
is why we can respond in kind.
Let's have a prayer. Father, I want to pray over everyone here. I want to pray over everyone who's watching and listening later. Father, I uplift all of these people who this word goes out to, because they are loved by you. They are your purchased possession. And we all have failed. We've all broken your covenant. And your covenant was never... we've broken our covenant with you. We can't break your covenant. Your covenant stands forever, which is that you have promised, if we cooperate, if we just open ourselves up to you, you will work mighty works in us. I pray for mighty works to be in the lives of these people that are here, that are watching later on or now live. Father, thank you. Thank you that you are a God who's called them. I'm reminding you, not because you don't remember, but because we don't remember. You are a God who's called us. And so, Father, act according to that, according to your calling. Forgive according to your calling to us to come back to you and return to you. I thank you for your character as revealed in the scriptures. I thank you for the grace and truth, without which the law is just empty, but which coming through the law, originating in Jesus, is everything to us. Please bring us into that face-to-face as a friend relationship, where the more we behold you, the more we become like you. And as we eat, I pray that you'll bless our food as well and our fellowship together in Jesus' name. Amen.